A straight razor is a razor with a blade that can fold into its handle. They are also called open razors and cut-throat razors. Although straight razors were once the principal method of manual shaving, they have been largely overshadowed by the safety razor, which incorporates a disposable blade. Electric razors of various types have also been an available alternative, especially since the 1950s. Despite this, straight razors still hold a market share, and forums and outlets provide products, directions, and advice to straight razor users. Straight razor manufacturers still exist in Europe, Asia, and North America. Antique straight razors are also actively traded. Straight razors require considerable skill to hone and strop, and require more care during shaving. These methods were once a major portion of the curriculum in barber colleges. History. The first narrow-bladed folding straight razors were listed by a Sheffield, England manufacturer in 1680. By 1740, Benjamin Huntsman was making straight razors complete with decorated handles and hollow ground blades made from cast steel, using a process he invented. Huntsman's process was adopted by the French sometime later, albeit reluctantly at first due to nationalist sentiments. The English manufacturers were even more reluctant than the French to adopt the process, and only did so after they saw its success in France. Sheffield steel, a highly polished steel, also known as Sheffield silver steel, and famous for its deep gloss finish, is considered a superior quality steel and is still used to this day in France by such manufacturers as Thiers Issard. Straight razors were the most common form of shaving before the 20th century and remained common in many countries until the 1950s. Straight razors eventually fell out of fashion. The first Challenger was manufactured by King C. Gillette, a double-edged safety razor with replaceable blades. These new safety razors did not require any serious tutelage to use. The blades were extremely hard to sharpen, and were meant to be thrown away after one use, and rusted quickly if not discarded. They also required a smaller initial investment, although they cost more over time. Despite its long-term advantages, the straight razor lost significant market share, as shaving became less intimidating and men began to shave themselves more. The demand for barbers providing straight razor shaves decreased. Parts description. The parts of a straight razor and the function are described as follows. The narrow end of the blade rotates on a pin called the pivot, between two protective pieces called the scales or handle. The upward curved metal end of the narrow part of the blade beyond the pivot is called the tang and acts as a lever to help raise the blade from the handle. One or two fingers resting on the tang also helps stabilize the blade while shaving. The narrow support piece between the tang and the main blade is called the shank, but this reference is often avoided because it can be confusing. The shank sometimes features decorations and the stamp of the country of origin. The top side and the underside of the shank can sometimes exhibit indentations known as fluting, or jimps for a more secure grip. The curved lower part of the main blade from the shank to the cutting edge is called the shoulder. The point where the shoulder joins the cutting edge is called the heel. A thick strip of metal running transversely at the junction where the main blade attaches to the shank is called the stabilizer. The stabilizer can be double, single, or can be absent in some razor models. The first stabilizer is usually very narrow and thicker and runs at the shank to blade junction, covering the shank and just spilling over to the shoulder. The second stabilizer can be distinguished since it is considerably wider and narrower, appearing after the first stabilizer and running lower into the shoulder. The arched, non-cutting top of the blade is called the back or the spine, while the cutting part of the blade opposite the back is called the cutting edge. Finally, the other free end of the blade, at the opposite end of the tang, is called the point and, sometimes, the head of the nose. There are usually 2, but sometimes 3, pins in the handle. The middle pin, if present, is plastic-coated and is called the center plug. Its function is to stabilize the sides of the handle so that they cannot be squeezed in the middle and acts as a bridge between them. When folded into the scales, the blade is protected from accidental damage, and the user is protected from accidental injury. During folding, the back of the blade, being thicker normally with a curved cross-section, acts as a natural stopper and prevents further rotation of the blade out of the handle from the other side. The frictional force between the scales and the tang applied about the pivot is called the tension, and it determines how freely the blade rotates. About the point of rotation, a proper amount of tension should be present for safety reasons, to ensure that the blade does not spin freely when opening or closing. Construction. Straight razors consist of a blade sharpened on one edge and a handle attached to the blade through pin. The blade can then rotate in and out of the handle. The blade can be made of either stainless steel, which is resistant to rust but can be more difficult to hone, or high carbon steel, which is much easier to hone, obtains a sharper edge but will rust more easily than stainless steel if neglected. Cheap stainless steel straight razors from Asia and more expensive stainless steel and carbon steel razors from Europe are available. A razor blade starts as a shape called the blanks applied by the steel manufacturer. Forging. The first step is to clean the blank using a heavy forge. The material used for open razors is steel with a minimum carbon content of 0.6%. This percentage of carbon content ensures optimum hardness, flexibility, and resistance to wear. Following the forging stage, a hole is drilled in the tang at the pivot point. This is a crucial step, since after the steel hardening process it would be impossible to drill. This process requires great skill, hardening and tempering. The steel is hardened through a special process where the forged steel blade is heated up to approximately 760 degrees Celsius dependent on the specific steel. This heating enables fast and uniform heating of the steel at the optimum temperature for maximum hardness. The tempering stage follows the hardening process, where the blade is heated in a bath of oil at a temperature between 200 to 400 degrees Celsius. Tempering imparts the steel its flexibility and toughness according to the phase diagrams for steel. There are three types of steel blade according to the level of tempering it has received: hard-tempered, medium-tempered and soft-tempered. Hard-tempered edges last longer but sharpening them is difficult. The converse is true for soft-tempered blades. The characteristics of medium-tempered blades are in between the two extremes. Grinding. Following the processes of hardening and tempering, the blanks are ground according to the two fundamental blade cross-sectional area profiles. Finishing. Subsequent to grinding, the blade is polished to various degrees of gloss. The finest finish used in the most expensive razors is the mirror finish. Mirror finish is the only finish used if gold leafing is to be part of the decoration of the blade. Satin finish requires less polishing time and therefore is not as expensive to produce. This finish is mostly used with black acid etching. Satin finish can sometimes be applied as a compromise to the back of the blade, while the mirror finish and gold leafing are applied to the more visible front of the blade. This way the blade will not be as expensive as a fully mirror-finished one. Metal plating is also used, using nickel or silver, but it is not preferred because the plating eventually erodes through use, revealing the underlying metal, which is often of inferior quality. Blade decoration. The blade is decorated by engraving a gold leafing depending on the price. Less expensive blades undergo an electrolytic black acid engraving process. For more expensive blades, gold leafing applied by hand is employed, following a traditional process. Sharpening. Sharpening is the final stage in the process. At first the blade is sharpened on a grinding wheel. Following that, the blade can be honed by holding the blades against the flat side of rotating round stones, or by drawing the blade across stationary flat stones. The cutting edge is finished using a strop. Sharpening is usually not completed during manufacturing, instead being done after purchase. Handle materials and the properties. Handle scales are made of various materials, including mother-of-pearl, bakelite, celluloid, bone, plastic, wood, horn, acrylic, ivory and tortoise shell. Celluloid can spontaneously combust at elevated temperatures. Buffalo horn tends to deform with time and it possesses form memory, so it tends to warp. Mother-of-pearl is a brittle material and can exhibit cracks after some use. Resin-impregnated wooden handles are water-resistant, do not deform, and the weight complements the blades to provide good overall balance for the razor. Snakewood, Rosamum guianensis, is also suitable for long-term and intensive use. The mechanical properties of bone make it a good handle material. Handles were once made of elephant ivory, but this has been discontinued, though fossil ivory, such as mammoth, is still sometimes used, and antique razors with ivory scales are occasionally found. Blade geometry and characteristics. The geometry of the blade can be categorized according to the following three factors. First, according to the shape of the profile of the point of the razor. Second, according to the type of grinding method used for the blade, the degree of curvature, and therefore hollowness, of the sides of the cross-section of the razor blade depends on the grinding method. Finally, the blades are categorized according to the width. Point type blades are at first categorized according to point type. There are three main types of point. Round point. As the name implies, the point profile is semicircular and therefore it lacks any sharp end points. As such, it is a more forgiving blade than the other two types, and, although lacking the pinpoint accuracy of the other two, it is recommended for relatively new users. There are also secondary edge types that derive from a combination of the above, such as half-round point incorporating round edges joined by a linear segment, square, spike or sharp point, so called because the point profile is straight and terminates at a very sharp point perpendicular to the cutting edge of the razor. This type of blade is used for precise shaving in small areas, but, at the risk of pinching the skin, it requires some experience in handling. French point. Its point profile resembles a quarter circle, but with a sharper angled curve, and while it ends in a similarly sharp point as the square point, it lacks the abrupt straight line edge profile. The difference between these two is mainly aesthetic, although the French point may help to shave difficult spots, such as under the nose. Grinding method. The second category refers to the type of grinding method used and, since it affects the curvature of the blade cross-section, includes the following two main types of blade grinds. Hollow grind, indicating that the sides of the blade cross-section are concave. Flat or straight grind, indicating that the sides of the blade cross-section are linear. This cross-section most closely resembles a wedge, and therefore this blade is sometimes called the wedge. The combination of the types found in these two classification categories can, in theory, lead to a wide variety of blade types such as round point, hollow ground, square point, flat ground, etc. But in practice, some points are combined with a specific grind. As an example, a French point blade is usually flat ground. A hollow grind produces a thinner blade than the flat grind because it removes more material from the blade. The hollow ground blade flexes more easily and provides more feedback on the resistance the blade meets while cutting the hair, which is an indicator of blade sharpness. Hollow ground blades are preferred by most barbers, and some high-end razor manufacturers limit the production exclusively to hollow ground razors. Blade width. The third and final category refers to blade width. The width of the blade is defined as the distance between the back of the blade and the cutting edge. It is expressed in units of eighth of an inch. The sizes vary from 9.5 mm up to 22 mm, rarely 25 mm. A wider blade can carry more lather, much like a scoop, during multiple successive shaving strokes, and thus it allows the user more shaving time and minimizes blade rinse cycles. The disadvantage of the wider blade is that it is not as maneuverable as a narrower blade. A narrow blade can shave tight facial spots such as under the nose, but it must be rinsed more often. The most popular blade width size is 16 mm. Stability and balance. The degree of hollowness and thus the cross-sectional area of the blade vary depending on the grinding method used. Higher degree of hollowness in the blade implies a thinner cross-section, and this affects the stability of the blade. The thinner the blade, the more flexible it is. The length and weight of the blade and handle and the relation to each other determines the balance of the straight razor. Transverse stabilizer. For hollow ground blades, stability is augmented by a transverse stabilizer in the form of one or two narrow strips of thicker metal running from the back of the blade to the end of the shoulder. This piece, if present, is simply called the stabilizer and indicates a hollow ground blade. Since a flat ground blade is massive and stable enough to not need stabilizer, a double stabilizer implies 1/1 hollow ground blade. The stabilizer protects the blade from torsional bending in the transverse direction. Longitudinal stabilizer. In addition to the transverse stabilizer, a longitudinal stabilizer is sometimes created in the form of a ridge parallel to the cutting edge, and the blade is ground in two areas or bevels, each with different degrees of hollowness or curvature. The area between the back of the blade and the ridge is typically less hollow, featuring a larger radius of curvature, also called the belly, and the area between the ridge and the cutting edge, which is more hollow, i.e., with a smaller radius of curvature. These two bevel areas have different curvatures, and in a well-made razor they transition seamlessly in the ridge and the cutting edge, respectively. Sometimes the number of bevels is 3. The ridge stabilizes the blade against flexing in the longitudinal direction by acting as a spine for the blade in that direction. The distance between the ridge and the back of the blade is inversely proportional to the hollowness of the blade and is described in fractional terms in ascending steps of 1/4 as, for example, 1/4 hollow, 1/2 hollow, or 4/4 or 1/1. Full hollow indicates that the stabilizing ridge is very close to the midsection of the blade and the farthest from the cutting edge compared to the other grades. This is considered the most expensive blade. At the highest end of hollow ground, more hollow than even the 1/1 grade, is the so-called singing razor, so named because its blade produces a specific resonant tone when plucked, similar to a guitar string. However, such use is not recommended as it can distort the cutting edge. Its manufacturing process is so demanding that a full 25% of the blades get rejected as not meeting standards. Stability and sharpness. There is a trade-off between stability and long-term blade sharpness. A full hollow ground blade can keep a very sharp edge even after a great number of honing cycles because of its high degree of hollowness, but it is more susceptible to torsional bending because it is thinner. A partially hollow blade cannot sustain the same degree of sharpness for as long, because as the cutting edge erodes it can eventually reach the stabilizing ridge faster, but it is more stable because it is less hollow. In addition, a flat ground blade, since by definition is not hollow at all, is the most stable of the blades, but because its cross-sectional area is the largest it also feels heavier than hollow ground, and this can affect the feel and balance of the blade. Balance. A razor is well balanced if when opened it balances about its pivot pin, indicating that the torques about the pivot point, caused by the corresponding weight distributions of the blade and the handle along the respective lengths, counterbalance each other. A well-balanced razor is both safer to handle when open and easier to shave with. Uses. The characteristics of each blade type determine the type of recommended uses for each blade as well as the maintenance routines. Each type has its own strengths and weaknesses depending on the requirements of use. Extra hollow blades such as singing blades are the thinnest and therefore they provide the best possible shave from all the other types. However, they are also very flexible and therefore not suitable for tasks requiring increased pressure to the blade such as heavy beard growth etc. Care should also be taken when stropping so that the thin blade will not be overly stressed, since it cannot withstand abuse as well as lower grades. Flat ground razors are very stable and as such they can handle tough shaving jobs since they do not easily deform under pressure and they can take rough handling such as heavy stropping and honing. Usage. Shaving is done with the blade at approximately an angle of 30 degrees to the skin and in a direction perpendicular to the edge. An incision requires the movement of the blade to be sideways or in a direction parallel to the edge. These circumstances are always avoided by the shaver, who always shaves in a direction perpendicular to the cutting edge of the blade. To be most effective, a straight razor must be kept extremely sharp. The edge is delicate, and in expert use may bend or fold over the razor's edge. To unfold and straighten the microscopic sharp edge, one must strop the blade on leather periodically. To sharpen or finish the blade using a suspended strop, the razor is pushed toward the suspension ring while both the back and the cutting edge lie flat on the strop and with the back of the blade. No pressure should be applied on the cutting edge. A strop may be two-sided with leather on one side and cloth on the other side. The cloth is used for blade alignment and sharpening. The leather is for finishing. The stropping process involves sliding the razor blade flat on the strop. Upon reaching the end of the cloth and leather near the suspension ring, the blade is turned about its back until the cutting edge touches the strop. It is then pulled toward the rectangular handle of the strop with back and cutting edge flat on the strop as before. The blade is moved in a slightly diagonal direction so to give every point of the edge a chance to touch the strop, without applying too much pressure. This process aligns the cutting edge properly with the back of the blade, avoiding bumps on the cutting edge. Rotating the blade on the strop about the cutting edge can damage it because such use will impact the micro-alignment of the edge. Depending on use and condition, the blade can be sharpened occasionally by using a razor hone. Strops prepared with pastes containing fine grit are also used for honing but are not recommended for the inexperienced user, as they can easily rake off the edge if they apply the wrong amount or apply too much pressure. Some strops have a linen or canvas back embedded with a fine abrasive used to maintain a sharp edge before final polishing with the leather side. A face's worth of thick hair may require multiple stroppings for one shave, but a blade is usually honed only 2 or 3 times a year. Occasional regrinding by a professional may be required to restore a badly worn or damaged edge. Shaving soap in a cup is traditionally lathered and applied using a rotating in and out motion of a shaving brush, usually made of boar or badger bristles. The shave is completed using as few strokes as possible, stropping sparingly if at all. A second shave with another razor in an alternate direction against the beard yields an extremely close shave. Rinsing with cold water constricts minor abrasions or cuts, followed by patting dry and in astringent or after-shave lotion. More serious nicks can be attended with direct pressure for perhaps a minute with a styptic pencil, or with an application of a household astringent such as witch hazel. A light steady touch is most effective at providing a close shave, preserving the edge and avoiding cuts. In the heyday of straight razor shaving, wealthy users maintained a weekly rotation of 7 razors to reduce wear on any one piece. Straight razors were often sold in special boxes of 7 labeled for the days of the week. However, many users owned only one razor.